you everyone for being here and for all these wonderful stories. I'm gonna wrap it up tonight with two tales of some of my favorite sages or perhaps wise fools. Ganesha had the head of an elephant and the body of a boy, a sturdy, stocky boy. Pudgy, said his father, Shiva. Big boned, said his mother, Parvati. Well, he would have to be, wouldn't he, to carry the weight of an elephant's head on his shoulders, which usually stopped any further discussion, since Shiva was in fact directly responsible for Ganesha having an elephant's head in the first place. But that is another story. In this story, it is breakfast. Ganesha was sitting at the breakfast table with his father Shiva, his mother Parvati, and his big brother Skanda. And on that breakfast table, there was a bowl of sugared plums. Now, Ganesha loved just about any sweet, but sugared plums were his favorite. Now, that bowl of sugared plums had been making the rounds around the table, and Ganesha had probably had more than his fair share by the time it came to rest in the middle of the table. Ganesha saw there was only one plum left. Well, he couldn't just let it sit there, now could he? He reached out for that last plum at the exact same moment that his brother Skanda did. Both boys had hold of that plum, and neither one looked like he was about to let it go. Now, boys, don't argue over a sugared plum. Let us instead have a contest. The first one of you boys to circumambulate the whole world will have this last plum. Well, as soon as she had finished speaking, Skanda got up. Skanda was athletic and strong and won just about every contest he had ever been a part of. He got up, went straight out the door, called for his steed, a black stallion as fast as the wind, and he rode off. Ganesha sat at the table. He had a steed. He had a mount of his own. It was a magnificent mount. It was wonderful. It was a mouse. Well, actually, it was a demon that Ganesha had vanquished and transformed into a mouse. So, it was pretty special. And very strong. It would have to be, after all, to carry a boy with an elephant's head. But it was still, in shape, in size, a mouse. And a mouse's legs were nothing compared to a horse, especially a black stallion as fast as the wind. And Ganesha, sitting at that table, started to feel this contest was rigged. He looked out the door where Skanda had disappeared. He was probably already halfway around the world. Ganesha looked back at the table with his parents looking expectantly at him. And at that last sugared plum, which he really wanted. He looked at his parents again, and he had an idea. Ganesha got up and he called for his mount. He called for his mouse and he leapt upon it and he started to go all the way around the whole room, circling the dining room table where Shiva and Parvati were watching him, circling the room. When he had made a full circumambulation, he looked out the door where his brother had disappeared. There was no sign of him. So why not? Ganesha went around the whole world a second time, coming around in full circle. He looked out the room, out the door, still no sign of his brother. So Ganesha went round for a third time, a victory lap all the way around the whole room. Then he jumped off his mouse and he said, "I won!" Oh, dear, Ganesha, darling, I'm afraid you misunderstood the terms of the contest. You were to have circumambulated the whole world, but you have not even left this room. But mother, father, I did not need to leave this room, for you are all the world to me. And yes, Parvati gave Ganesha that last sugared plum. To travel to another part of the world. You may well have heard of McCool, one of the greatest heroes of all of Ireland. Now, McCool was renowned as a fighter, a skilled warrior, and a leader of men. But he was also renowned for having an uncanny wisdom of always seeming to know exactly what he needed to do. And this is the tale of how he got that wisdom. Now, McCool had been raised in secret in the woods by two warrior women. They had raised him up and taught him everything he needed to know to be a great warrior, the fighting skills, the hunting skills, how to ride a horse and hunt with the hounds. By the time he was a young man, he felt ready to make his mark on the world, to join the Fenians, to become one of the king's warriors. But no, the warrior woman said there was one lesson yet he needed to learn. He needed to become a poet. For how else was he to tell the great tales of the deeds that he was going to do? And well, he never did anything by half. So since the warrior women did not have the skills to teach him this last bit of his training to be a poet, he went straight to the top, to the king's own poet, to the master poet of all the land. but he had a bit of a trouble tracking him down. For the master poet was not at the castle, and he was not traveling the land, telling his tales and sharing his poems. No, when Finn finally brought him to ground, he was sitting on a riverbank, fishing. Now, Finn didn't like to disturb a man at his fishing, so he hung back a bit. And he had a chance to watch as the master poet sat there just fishing like any man might. But every time that he caught a fish, and he caught quite a few actually, as he watched that afternoon, every time the master caught a fish, he'd take him off the hook, he'd weigh it in his hands, he'd look at it, then he'd make a look of disgust, and he'd throw that fish back into the water. So that by the end of the day, the master poet had nothing to show for his whole afternoon of fishing. And it was then that Finn introduced himself and told the master how he wished to become a poet as well and wished to apprentice himself. And the master, over a supper of thin gruel, since he had no fish, agreed. If Finn would take care of the cooking for them, and if he would sit beside the master poet. For the master poet wasn't planning to go anywhere, he was going to fish, and Finn would have to sit beside him if he is going to find out how to be a master poet himself. So Finn agreed, and the very next day, his apprenticeship started. The two of them sat side by side on the riverbank, and the master poet started to recite his poems. And it was Finn's job to just listen, but not just with his ears, but with his whole being, to take in not just the words and the meaning, but the language, until they came a part of himself. And while they were doing all this, the two of them were sitting there fishing. And every time the master poet caught a fish, he would take it off the hook, he'd look it over, and he'd make a look of disgust, and he'd throw it back in the water. But every time Finn caught a decent-sized fish, well, he kept it for their supper, and he cooked it up that night. And so the year passed, with gradually Finn starting to tell the stories and the poems back to the master poet. And then at the very end of a year's time, there was Finn sitting on the bank starting to tell his own tales and his own poems to the master poet. And still the two of them sat there fishing. And Finn was just about telling the last word of the last poem that he had just put together himself, when the master poet leapt to his feet, for the fishing rod was about to take him right into the drink. There was a fish on the end of his line, such as he'd never had before. It was trying to take the fisherman into the water, just as the fisherman was trying to take the fish out. Well, Finn, he grabbed hold of the master poet to try and keep him on the bank, and the master poet pulled in that fish, and oh, what a fish it was. It was a salmon, and oh, the size and the weight of it, the way the scales shone in the light. Oh, it was the most amazing fish Finn had ever seen in his life, and oh, it about broke his heart, thinking that the master poet was about to throw that fish back in the water. But the master poet, he was weighing that fish, he was looking at it, but he was not throwing back in the water. Instead, he turned to Finn. Finn, Do you know what this is? Do you know what this is? Aye, it's a fish. Finn, no, this is not just any fish. This is the fish I have been fishing for. This, Finn, is the salmon of wisdom. The fish that supped on the 9 acorns that fell from the world tree and took into its very flesh all the wisdom of the world. Can you imagine that, Finn? Oh, the first bite of this, Finn, and I shall have that wisdom too. This is the fish, Finn. You'll be cooking for me tonight. But mind you, don't you be taking any bite ahead of me. This one is for me and me alone. Oh, of course. And so Finn, he took that fish and he cooked it up in the skillet, and it was such a big fish, it barely fit in, and it was so juicy and rich. It was just bubbling, and the fish oil was spitting out all over the place. Finn was dancing about as he's trying to cook just to keep out of the way. But even so, one bit of that hot fish oil with a little bit of fish scale came flying straight out of the pan when he wasn't looking and hit him right in the thumb. And it burned him so. Oh, he just did the first thing that you would do if you had a burned thumb. He put it straight in his mouth. And the minute that he did so, the whole world changed. It was exactly the same as it had been before, and yet it was entirely different. For all of a sudden, Finn could feel how he was a part of the world, and the world was a part of him. Oh, he could feel the earth in his bones, the river in his veins, the wind in his lungs, the fire in his heart. And he could see the threads that went from one thing to another, and how, why, if he went this way, and it would, like a spider's web, vibrate out over here, and this would happen, and that would happen, and it was so amazing. And then Finn took his thumb out of his mouth, and there was the fish about to burn on the skillet, and he went right back to cooking up that fish and serving it up to the master poet without thinking another thought about it. Now the master poet, he took his time, savoring that first bite of that fish, and it was delicious. It was the most flavorful fish he'd ever had in his life. It was magnificent. It was, though, well, just fish. Where was the wisdom? Where was all that knowledge of the world? Finn, you've robbed me, lad. You've taken the first bite. You've taken the first bite of this fish. Oh, no, I never. I was just cooking it up for you. Like you said, too. I was just cooking. It was a juicy fish, and the way it spit and spat and all. And well, I suppose a wee bit of that oil did hit me in the thumb, but it was just so hot I had to put it in my thumb, and he put that thumb in his mouth and demonstrated how he cooled it off. And as soon as he did so, the whole world changed again. It was exactly like it had been before, and yet entirely different. Finn could feel how he was a part of everything, and everything was a part of him. And oh, if he did this, that would happen, and that, and oh, it was amazing. And then he took his thumb out of his mouth. And because he had been telling the tale of what had happened, he had been paying more attention this time. And when he pulled his thumb out of his mouth, he realized he had indeed taken the wisdom of the world into his own being, with just that little bit of fish oil and fish scale burning his thumb. And the master poet saw how he had been but the vehicle, for Finn had been chosen by the salmon of wisdom to receive that wisdom. And so it was that Finn went on to become a great warrior, a leader of men. But every time he got into a bit of trouble, or he wasn't sure quite what to do next, or if someone asked him his advice or to help them out, well, the very first thing he did before he called for his horse or his hound, before he grabbed his sword, the very first thing he would do would be to put his thumb in his mouth and sit there for a while. And then by the time he took his thumb out of his mouth, he always knew exactly what it was he needed to do next.